The town of Millhaven was nestled by the slow, winding Mill River, a body of water that had been the lifeblood of the community for generations. The river gave them food, water, and a place to swim and relax. But the river had changed. The first signs were small: fish dying, strange odors wafting through the streets, people complaining about sudden headaches and strange dreams. No one thought much of it at first, until the first death. Tom Larson, a young and healthy swimmer, was found convulsing by the riverbank one afternoon. His skin was burning hot, his eyes wild, blood trickling from his nose and ears. The doctors had no idea what was wrong. By the next morning, he was dead. And he wasn't the only one. Over the following week, 5 more people in town reported similar symptoms: violent seizures, fever, confusion, and 2 of them were dead within hours. At first, people thought it was a virus or a chemical spill, but then came the changes no one could explain. People who had fallen ill began to exhibit bizarre primal behavior before succumbing to their symptoms. Emily O'Neill, a mild-mannered librarian, was found crouched over a dead deer, gnawing at its raw flesh with her hands. When her husband tried to stop her, she tore into him with animalistic fury, tearing at his face with her nails and teeth. By the time the sheriff arrived, Emily had disappeared into the woods, naked, covered in blood. A pattern began to emerge. Victims of the disease weren't just dying, they were transforming. Their minds seemed to deteriorate rapidly as something within them reverted to a more primal state. Their bodies twisted into grotesque, feral versions of themselves, their bones cracking and reshaping, fingers curling into claws, jaws elongating. The town descended into chaos as more people became infected, and the lucky ones who hadn't fled barricaded themselves indoors, praying for the horror to pass. The river, once peaceful, now held the town in a death grip. Dr. Kate Monroe, a virologist who had lived in Millhaven her whole life, was one of the few who hadn't fled. She had been studying the river, trying to understand what was happening. In her lab, hidden deep in the heart of the town's old hospital, she worked day and night, watching samples of the water under her microscope. What she discovered chilled her to the core. It was a bacteria, something she had never seen before. An ancient organism that seemed to have been dormant for centuries until now. The bacteria didn't just infect the brain, it consumed it, rewiring the neural pathways and stripping away the parts of the mind that made someone human. As the infection spread, victims lost their sense of self, their memories, and their reasoning, becoming feral wild animals driven only by hunger and instinct. There was no cure, at least not yet. Kate's eyes burned as she scrolled through pages of research, looking for anything that could help her find an antidote. She had isolated the bacteria, and she believed she was close to discovering how to stop it. But the town was falling apart faster than she could work. Outside, the streets echoed with the howls and screams of the infected. They roamed in packs now, hunting those still human, smashing through windows and doors, tearing apart anyone they could get their claws on. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty halls of the hospital as Kate worked, knowing she was running out of time. Her only companion was a man named Jack, a former hunter who had lived in the town his entire life. He had managed to survive by barricading himself in the hospital with Kate, using his knowledge of the woods and animals to keep the infected at bay. But even Jack was starting to show signs of infection. His hands trembled, his speech slurred, and his eyes were beginning to take on the glazed, wild look she had seen in others before they turned. "We don't have long," Jack rasped, his voice thick with pain as he pressed a cloth to his bleeding arm. "How close are you?" "I think I have it," Kate whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. She held up a small vial of clear liquid, the antidote she had been working on for days. It was untested, but it was their only hope. "We need to get this to the river," she said. "If we can introduce it into the water supply, we might be able to stop the bacteria from spreading. It won't help the ones who've already turned, but it could save the rest." Jack nodded, but his eyes flickered with doubt. "And what about me?" he asked quietly. "Am I too far gone?" Kate swallowed, her throat tight. She didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. His veins had already begun to darken beneath his skin, spreading like spider webs across his arms and chest. He didn't have much time left. "We'll figure it out," she said instead, forcing a smile. "Let's get this done first." Together, they gathered what supplies they could and prepared to make their way to the river. The hospital doors creaked as they opened, revealing the nightmare outside. The streets were littered with bodies, and the air was thick with the stench of blood and decay. The infected roamed in packs, their twisted, animal-like forms moving through the shadows, sniffing the air for their next prey. As they made their way to the river, Jack's breathing became more labored. His hands twitched uncontrollably, and he had to fight to keep from collapsing. The infection was taking hold faster than Kate had anticipated. When they reached the riverbank, the water was eerily still, reflecting the darkening sky. Kate knelt by the edge, carefully uncorking the vial. Her hands shook as she poured the antidote into the water, watching as it dispersed into the current. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the woods behind them, a guttural growl echoed through the trees. Kate turned to see a pack of infected charging toward them, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Jack stepped forward, raising his rifle. "Go," he grunted through clenched teeth. "Get out of here, I'll hold them off." "No," Kate cried, but Jack was already firing, his shots echoing through the night as the infected swarmed toward him. Kate had no choice. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of Jack's gunshots fading behind her. She didn't stop running until she was far from the river, far from the town, far from the horrors that had consumed Millhaven. The antidote was in the water now. Whether it would work, whether it was too late, she didn't know. All she could do was hope that somewhere, deep in the heart of the river, something had changed. As she looked back at the river, she could almost swear she saw the surface ripple, just for a moment, as if the water itself was alive, fighting back against the darkness. But the nightmare was far from over. The river was still hungry,